And I think that it's making a straw man out of Parmenides. Plato does something similar with Heraclitus. Okay, so Heraclitus is an incredibly sophisticated thinker. This guy, when he describes everything in the cosmos as an ever-changing fire, he is not using fire the way that Thales used water, as a kind of element from out of which all other elements or things can be derived, right? We had thinkers very early in the history of pre-Socratic philosophy who took one or another element as fundamental. In the case of Thales, it was water, and they derived everything else like earth and air and fire from out of it. It's a huge mistake to think that that's what Heraclitus means by fire. If you want to understand what Heraclitus means by fire, look at what Werner Heisenberg says about him in Physics and Philosophy, the greatest German scientist of the era of the Second World War, German physicist rather. Werner Heisenberg, one of the pioneers of quantum theory, writes about Heraclitus in Physics and Philosophy and says that how Heraclitus describes fire and its relationship with the psyche, and the way in which fire is a metaphor for the logos, okay, the order in the cosmos, and the relationship between the fire and the psyche, to the mind of Werner Heisenberg, was some kind of a precursor to the relationship between consciousness and quantum potential in quantum theory. So that what Heraclitus means by fire is something like what we mean by quantum potential, right? You had these like early atomists that thought the world was basically made up of marbles. Their metaphor for the fundamental stuff were like something like, you know, the marbles the Greek children played with.
Right.
You had others who believed that some substance, you know, like water, went through various changes of state, and that all things arose, had their genesis in that manner. What Heraclitus is saying is that what everything is made up out of is a dynamic flux that can't be pinned down, and that is never in a static state. At no point do you find it in a static state. It's something that's always inherently in a dynamic flux, and that thing is integrally interconnected with consciousness, or what Heraclitus calls psyche, psyche. And the relationship between psyche and this dynamic flux has a logos to it. It has an order to it. Okay, and it expresses certain teleology. And this is very similar to what we eventually arrived at on the other side of atomism in the quantum theory that, you know, describes the collapse of the quantum wave potential by consciousness. So Heraclitus, you know, is so sophisticated in his ontological thinking that, you know, Werner Heisenberg, I think, rightly saw his understanding of, you know, the cosmic flux and its relationship to the mind as a precursor of quantum theory. And Heraclitus makes it very clear that he isn't saying there's no such thing as existence. In other words, it's not a view of pure becoming as opposed to being. It's that existence is always in a state of process, and this process does have a kind of teleology to it. And so when Aristotle claims that Plato developed the theory of forms because Heracliteans like Cratylus, Plato's teacher in his youth, thought that you couldn't know anything about things that are in a state of perpetual flux, this is not credible. Okay, there's no way that Plato did not study Heraclitus for himself. There's no way that, you know, this book that we call the Fragments today, that used to be called On Nature, isn't a book that Plato picked up and read for himself. He probably pored over it for years. And as a student of the Heraclitean school. And so even if Cratylus was such an imbecile that he misunderstood Heraclitus so badly that he says, Heraclitus shouldn't have said, you can't step into the same river twice. You can't even step into it once, because as your foot is going into the river, it's not the same river. The waters keep flowing, right? Even if Cratylus was such an imbecile to believe that Heraclitus was advocating a view of such sheer becoming that, you couldn't know anything about objects, right? That, knowledge was ruled out, and that we were going to wind up in a state of like perpetual skepticism regarding everything. There's no way that Plato wouldn't have understood Heraclitus better than Cratylus himself did, right? I mean, this is typical. Like, you go to study a certain doctrine with some teacher, and that teacher is a lame representative of that school of thought. And you're introduced to that school of thought through the particular teacher, but then you go and, study the origins of that thought yourself, and you come to a better understanding of it than this person who, gave you some introductory lessons concerning. And so I have to believe that that's the case in terms of Plato's understanding of Heraclitus. And I argue that it is the case on the basis of all kinds of remarks that Plato makes in Cratylus and Theaetetus in particular. There are two dialogues, dialogue named after the Heraclitean teacher. We had Cratylus, and another dialogue, Theaetetus, in which, and you have to read my essay Pharmacon Artis to really be able to see, how I do this, but in which, if you subtract the forms that Plato's setting forth, the account of the world that you're left with is a deep understanding of the teaching of Heraclitus. So basically, you can see from in between the lines of Cratylus and Theaetetus that Plato thought deeply about the doctrine of Heraclitus, but then he wants to make this straw man from out of Heraclitus the same straw man that Aristotle gives us when he says Plato studied with Cratylus. He saw that if you have this view of all things in flux, knowledge is not possible. And so he came up with the theory of forms as a way to build an epistemology, to build essentially what becomes the first theory of knowledge and the basis for science, ultimately.
Yeah.
But it requires making a straw man out of Heraclitus in order to do that. Because, see, essentially what Plato does is this. He takes Heraclitus and he turns him into this cardboard cutout where everything is in a state of flux. We can't know anything about physis, right? And in fact, the mind is not stable enough and separate enough from the flux of nature for the subject to predicate anything of objects that have independent existence. He turns this into the view of Heraclitus, right? So everything is flowing. You can't know anything about the dynamic physis. That's, let's say, the material world, right? Hule, matter, is a dynamic physis that you can't know anything about because it's always flowing. Then he makes a straw man out of Parmenides.
Right.
And he said, okay, well, what can be salvaged from out of Parmenides is this idea of the one as what gives something enough coherence to be the particular thing that it is, namely to make it a substance. And he says, instead of there being this one that's synonymous with infinite and eternal being, which would render the entire world of multiplicity an illusion, there is a multiplicity of ones. There's a multiplicity of unities. And this multiplicity of unities interacts with or interferes with nature in a state of flux in order to give us the objects of our perceptible world that we experience. And here, the Pythagorean doctrine becomes significant because this multiplicity of ones, okay, that he's getting from Parmenides, he's adapting from out of Parmenides, it takes a mathematical form, which he's getting from the Pythagorean order. So remember,
Right.
Pythagoras, quote unquote, believed the world is made of number. That's an oversimplification. But Pythagoras thought that the fundamental constructs of the physical world were geometric and mathematical in nature. So Plato takes the oneness of the one of Parmenides and he fuses it with the geometric quality of the fundamental nature of reality as Pythagoras elaborated it. And he creates these forms, which he compares to geometers' templates. The templates that geometers work with. Templates. They use them in machine shops also, even back in ancient Greece. The templates that, a craftsman, technitas, the craftsmen work with. And so you have these templates that each have absolute and perfect unity, right? So the form of the circle is not circular. The form of the circle isn't round. And the form of heaviness isn't actually heavy. It doesn't weigh anything. Each of these forms is absolute. It's perfect. It's infinite and eternal in the same way as the one of Parmenides. But there's a multiplicity of these, and they're of a geometric or mathematical nature. And these infinite and eternal forms interfere with the flux of pure matter, of hyle, right, as a kind of dynamic energy, the fire of Heraclitus. And from out of this interference, you get the objects of our world, the things that we experience, right? And also the finitude of the human mind as shaped by experience in a human body. Okay, this is how basically Plato develops the theory of forms by taking a straw man Heraclitus and a straw man Parmenides and fusing them together, also drawing on the mathematical thinking of Pythagoras. And I think the most complete form of this that you see in the Platonic corpus is in the dialogue Timaeus, Plato's dialogue Timaeus, where he talks about how the forms and matter, pure matter in a state of ceaseless flux and chaos, basically, I don't want to say intermix, but how they interact with each other in this void, in this chasm that he describes in Timaeus. And from out of this chasm, this interaction of forms and matter and flux produces the multifarious objects of our experience, of which we can predicate things, about which we can know things with reference to the eternal forms, right? So our rational minds are of the same nature as these infinite and eternal forms. And although our minds are ensconced in souls that are further shaped by the conditions of our physical body, it's still possible for our minds to grasp and analyze the physical world in terms of these supposedly non-physical forms. And that gives us the basis for, episteme, or what later comes to be framed as scientific knowledge about the world.